So yeah, do people have questions that they'd like to ask about? And I'd be happy to answer questions about this one or
All right, since I'm not knowledgeable in this, how many black folks try to go to Canada?
a lot. And so what would happen was there would be an event in a town that would be a catalyst for violence against black people. And if the town was close enough to Canada, the entire population would sort of just cross the border. Particularly in areas in, sort of the Minnesota, Detroit, like all of those sort of places. Something would happen, somebody would get lynched, somebody would open a school for blacks, and there would be a backlash against it. There's a report of 2,000 African Americans leaving a town to go to Canada, and like 4 of them stayed behind. I can't remember what the city is at the moment. Sometimes answering questions for book launches is kind of like cramming for a midterm because you're already on to the next book. But I'm glad to be able to answer that for you. Yes, a lot of them went to Canada, and the British at the time were really the police of the slave trade because they had decided that abolishing it was high on their priority list in the 1830s, and so their navy was also really involved in stopping.
So you've now written 3 books about Violet, although 2 of them have been published. What has surprised you about him as you've written about him?
What has surprised me about him? Goodness, he's such an interesting. I like him. I like the guy. What has surprised me about him specifically is, like, in terms of, I feel like I know him really well because I'm writing him, right? One of the things that has surprised me the most is how few people recognize that he's a deeply unreliable narrator. because a lot of people, he's affable and he's well-intentioned, so being affable and well-intentioned counts for a lot. And he wants to do the right thing. So a lot of people are sort of like really, really on board with him and his version of events. And it has surprised me how few people say, this guy's kind of an ass. Because he's got a lot of stuff, and he's really, really good at reading strangers, but he's terrible at reading anybody who he cares about or who he loves. And as a person, I feel like he makes a lot of interesting mistakes that are built in, but he's so well-intentioned, people sort of just like skip that part and don't really notice. But I'm shocked. Yeah, that has really surprised me, is how few people are like, the narrator's kind of a dilly, but and I love him because he is so well-intentioned and his heart's in the right place, but he doesn't always do the right thing, and he doesn't always read people the right way.
What was your relationship to your sources and basically like letting them go, deciding that maybe this one is certainly biased or they just want to tell your own story?
Great question. So I start with history books, and then I just poach their whole index, basically. And I'm like, okay, you can give me like a macroscopic view of the world that I'm talking about, and then what I prefer is to go back and read the first-person accounts. My relationship with various sources has been very different. Solomon Northrop, I was really trusting of that guy, and in terms of, this is what it's like to be kidnapped and spend 12 years as a slave. I was like, yep, that sounds about right. There are other accounts that, I wonder if I can even find it at this point. There was a fellow I quoted at the beginning of a chapter who, I was shocked by the quote specifically, because, yeah, I got it. His name was William Bobo. So Bill Bobo, believe it or not, was kind of a dick. William M. Bobo, or Billy Bobo, as I like to call him. This is a perfect example of me having a relationship with a source that is extremely conflicted, but also extremely useful. He wrote a book that was a travelogue called Glimpses of New York City by a South Carolinian who had nothing else to do. Sorry, right? That was published in 1852. Should I do the Southern accent?
Yes, please.
I'll tell you a good joke. The other day I saw a strapping fella standing on the corner of Franklin Street with his back to me. I walked quietly up and taking him roughly by the collar saying, "Oh, I've got you at last, you runaway scoundrel." If I'd fired a pistol near his ear, he would not have been more frightened. Breaking away from me, he left a dusty streak after him towards the river. So that account began, "I'll tell you a good joke." That's not a good joke. That's not a good joke. It's a really bad joke. But it's a great story. So I had a lot of sources like that where I was like, really? Really? Is that a good joke? Really? So thank you for asking that question. I tend to take things with a grain of salt when it comes to Billy Bobo.
Since she asked about your sources, I'm going to ask maybe more process related, because clearly you've got to do a bunch of editing that has nothing to do with continuity. It has to do with all like, really? This is, you've got to deal with this person who's saying what he's saying, and you've got historical fact that goes along with that. So how much of your process, like when you're both writing and then going back and editing, deals with, you've got to stay true to the fact that this is not Conan Doyle's London or Tolkien's Middle-earth, where you can just kind of make it up as you go along, because you either can or you don't care. But you've got U.S. history that people are going to know about.
I try to be, thank you for asking that question. I try to be as accurate as I possibly can, and a major help for me is the newspapers. So I spend about 6 months researching any book before I start writing it, and I just sort of roll around in it until my fingers get all pruny. And part of that process is reading microfilm of the newspapers. So day to day, I can see the advertisements. I can be like, fresh turkey leeches, and I'm like, great. Like, sounds healthy. Like, cool. But I can go through the advertisements like as I go through other articles in the papers, and I can note down things that I think are particularly topical or particularly cool. And I do make a lot of notes to that effect. Now, at the same time, in terms of writing historical fiction, I think it's extremely important that if your protagonist doesn't care about the historical fact, leave it out of the book, please. Like, Timothy Wilde never talks about when bridges were built, sort of thing. Like, he really doesn't speak much about some of the more sort of, and this park was, formed in blah, blah, blah year, and it was designed by so-and-so. Timothy's like, I don't care, I really care if fountains work or not, because I care whether or not fountains are working. So the City Hall fountain pisses Tim off in every book. Because dead fountains really annoy me. But, so that's just a little thing that he does in all three. But if it's a historical fact that I encountered that informs my knowledge of the world and that Timothy cares about, it might end up in the book if it's the most topical one, if it's the one that's the most relevant. If it's a historical fact that Timothy doesn't care about, I'm going to file it away just for, my worldview of the actual, novel, but I'm not gonna properly include it in terms of text.
Sort of piggybacking off that question, how hard is it to steer Tim Wilde as a man of his time versus your personal opinion, coming as a woman from 2013, writing about 1846?
I love steering him. Thank you for that question, too. This harks back to what I was saying recently. Just, in this other question, it's like, he's such an unreliable narrator. And I steer him in all sorts of directions that are well-intentioned and that are, he's a fundamentally good dude. But there are a lot of people who read the Timothy Wilde series who hate Mercy Underhill because she's not in love with Timothy. And I'm like, why would you? And he's great, he's amazing, he's fantastic, he's just he's the best person and he's lovely, but he doesn't laugh once in 3 books ever. The man is incapable of laughter. I wouldn't be tapping that either. So Valentine. Sure. But with Tim, he wants to do the right thing so much, and he's got a great sense of humor that he doesn't indulge in sort of joie de vivre terms, And so I think that it is really, really fair to say that I steer him in whatever direction I want him to, but I know that he's this angst monkey, and I know that he's just this pent-up ball of rage, and he's this walking little just hate everything, and I love him so much because of that, because when I'm writing him, and when I'm steering him, when I'm behind the wheel of Timothy Wilde, a lot of things that I am angry about, he can be angry about, So that is an extension of me, and that's totally legitimate. He can be just as mad as I am about all kinds of things. But it's all channeled toward the anger. At least he's funny about it. He's got the snark going on.
It's on political front, because they are fairly, for the time. There's like a lot of politics in them. How hard was that, given the bias of what we know now versus what you were reading then, versus trying to incorporate all that as well as incorporating that into the crime context as well? Can you talk?
I'll tell you, Tiffany.
Please do, Lyndsay.
It's the same animal, and it's so weird. When I'm researching Tammany Hall, and I'm looking at references to Tammany Hall, and people, you know, saying, okay, Tammany is really necessary because we have all of these. This is a political engine that needs to work. We need to win. We have a better opinion than the other political party. We have, you know, like fight, go team. And then there's this other aspect of it that it was a money-making venture. And if you look at how much control corporate lobbyists have over the White House and over, you know, lawmaking now, if you look at how much control corn subsidies and Monsanto and, you know, like, God knows the rest of it. Like, I could go on all day. But anyway, it is sanitized now. It's very sanitized, but it's very similar. Because if you don't have a big enough paycheck, you're not going to make much of a difference in Washington, D.C. And I think that it is a question of, you know, like, maybe I'm too cynical. I don't know. Jen, tell me.
She's not fair. Thank you.
She knows from politics, but like it's still, the United States has always been, and New York City to a certain extent. I think New York City more than the United States, but New York was founded as a money-making venture. So we were not based on religious freedom. We were not based on trying to escape from, you know, persecution. We were based on the Dutch wanting to make a buck, and then the British came along, and the British wanted to make a buck off of the town that the Dutch founded, and it is a thread that still runs through all of our political system. And I think that it is fair to say that the creepiest thing when I study Tammany Hall, and I study the way they try to make everyone who votes for their party feel like heroes and patriots, and the only good people, and anybody who votes for the other party are bad people. It's just creepy because it's the same. It's not very different. I don't have to answer more questions if you don't have any. I'm very happy.
Well, just to sort of continue with that thread, because actually some statistics do sort of show that right now in America we are the most polarized that we have been since the Civil War with regards to political opinions in the country, which is kind of interesting given the contextual history of your story, especially with regards to equal rights, you know, or rights at all for the purpose of your story. So continuing with that thread, and how you transformed it into fiction, with Seven for a Secret and presumably the next book, how have you sort of influenced the story from the citizen side? Because obviously we have Timothy Wilde representing the Copper Stars and the sort of beginning of sort of governments, if you will. Mm-hmm. What other social elements are sort of being brought into the story, and do we have to look forward to?
Oh, well. You didn't. Great question. You didn't have a lot of people who were trying to make a difference socially in that time period until slightly later. It had to be sort of tied to a religious organization specifically. So you would have something like the Catholic Orphan Asylum. You would have something along the lines of, okay, so we're all Presbyterians, we're all going to get together, and we're all going to give the money to the widows and the orphans, etc. What you didn't have was any sort of, there was not the sensibility that, like, we all need to help everyone so that everyone can live better. And people were literally starving to death in the streets. So the next one, to answer your question, in the Timothy Wilde series, is about the seamstresses. And this is, like, so long before Triangle Shirtwaist, but so looking forward to Triangle Shirtwaist, and like that sort of deal. And it was the next one is set during 1848, and 1848 is the year that the Seneca Falls Women's Rights Convention was held, and that was the first female rights convention held in the United States that was nationally publicized. And if you thought the quotes at the beginning of chapters were bad, if you thought they were bad for Gods of Gotham and Seven for a Secret, just wait until you hear what they had to say about ladies. So, we have a lot to say about ladies. So yeah, you can really look forward to that, or not. Or not look forward to that. I think would probably be better.
And that was literally stealing my next question, because one of the things in Gods of Gotham is, in Timothy's sort of almost obsessive relationship with Mercy, he puts her on a huge pedestal,
Yeah.
but leaves feminism completely out of it.
Yeah. Yeah. It's true. Well, he's not a feminist, he's just kind of a nice dude. You know? Like, I think there's a lot of those. You know, they're not necessarily feminists, but they're really nice, decent people. You know, like he's a good human. It does leave feminism completely out of it, and I think that he certainly meets some in the next one, and I'm happy to say that that's true. But I think that Timothy, one of my favorite things about Tim as a person, and one of the things that I wanted to build into his character from the get-go, is that he grew up in the dirt, and it was kind of Valentine's fault, but not really, and Valentine has a lot of emotional problems to do with that. But you know, Valentine took care of him to a certain extent, but he still grew up in really abject poverty. And he says at a certain point in Seven for a Secret, he makes a lot of mistakes in Seven for a Secret, and he says some fairly terrible racist shit occasionally, because he is not perfect. But he says at a certain point, when somebody accuses him of having, oh yeah, your white morals, why should I listen to them? And he says at a certain point, he's like, okay, yeah, that's fair, but my morals are based on poverty. They're not based on affluence. I didn't have money enough when I was a child to be, he says something like Valentine and I couldn't be particular towards anything except, lice when we were a kid. So he is a very egalitarian person, partly because of the fact that he was forced to be, and that he didn't know anything else, because he was 10 when his parents died. And so he grew up on the streets with all sorts of people, and that is a major part of who he is. And he is just sort of willing to listen and willing to take that next step with folks because of the fact that he had to learn how to do that. And it was much more effective than being in any way prejudiced when, you're living under a trash can. So he was Oscar the Grouch, He didn't have time to say, "You're blue, I don't want to talk to you," So I like that about Timothy. I think that that's a cool quality, and I'm happy that he has that.
So first of all, I'm really excited that Julius is going to be in more of this one, because I thought that he was a really interesting character from the first one, and I look forward to seeing more of him. And secondly, you've already partially answered this question, but I'm interested in how you balance a modern view of race with him being a man of his time, and how you keep him from being too idealized, but still on the right track.
Okay, killer question. This this is something that I've had to toe a very fine line with. He, like I just said, grew up in the streets, didn't have time to be very racist, didn't have time to be very sexist. He did not have the wherewithal, And so he's like, I will talk to... This is exactly the same thing that happened in 5 Points, by the way. Do you know how tap dancing began? That's a classic story. So in the 5 Points, everyone was too poor to care as much about racism as everybody else did. And so they're all living together, the Irish and the blacks, in the same neighborhood. And Irish music and Irish dance meets African music and African dance, and tap dancing is invented. You're welcome. So it was similar with Timothy, right? So he has this sort of sensibility that he didn't have time to, deal with things that he doesn't find to be personally important. At the same time, occasionally, every once in a while, somebody has said to me, Timothy has a really modern sensibility, and there's no way that he could possibly have been this cool and not racist, and you're making this up, and it's just because you're a white girl who lives in 2013. And I'm like, okay, so that's a fair criticism. But I think the people who are saying that haven't done their homework, because I have read, who do we think the radical abolitionists were? They were crazy abolitionists. They were risking their lives. There were African American abolitionists who were nuts, who were just putting themselves out there and saying, sure, attack me, I'm going to say this anyway. There were white abolitionists who were doing the same thing. There were other white abolitionists who were being very, very quiet about it and doing things like helping the Black Network form the Underground Railroad, or else the Underground Railroad wouldn't really have worked, because you needed a network of, houses along the way. So there were a lot of people who were very radical, and I have read their diaries, and I have read their letters, and they existed. So I'm not sorry about Timothy Wilde. The end.
Okay, guys, we're gonna stop it right there, and we're gonna sign some books, and yeah.